person, and anybody that's listening on Zoom, thank you for being here. I'm Jeremy Morgan, one of the two exhibitors in this exhibition, East Wind from the West. My co-exhibitor, Ren Ming, is a friend of 30 years, and we've collaborated on many projects, both in China and here in America. He came from China to America to understand Western art. I came from the UK to America to understand American art, and then Asian art, particularly China. And had the good fortune now for 25 years to be going to China fairly regularly until the era of COVID. Anyway, today I'm going to give a talk on my work and hopefully give you some context for my side of the show. We're very connected, as I think you'll find as you look at the work and hear both of us talk. Ren will be talking, Ming will be talking next week, I think on Friday. So hopefully that will be in Mandarin. I apologize to my Chinese listeners if I have no Chinese. I'm very ashamed of that, but it's a difficult language. And I want to speak it properly if I'm going to try, so forgive me. But anyway, today I'll be speaking in English, and hopefully if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, either during the talk or after. So I will get us underway because I know we started a little later than planned. So I just want you to read, somebody changed. Can you go back to this, Harry?
Yeah. Which one? This one, right? I'm sure.
Yeah. 什么啊？
My student Naomi giving us instructions. Okay, thank you, everybody. This is not going to be some fun. I'm going to read this for those who can't read it. This is some writings by a French writer, European cultural thinker, René Huey, around 1930. And I believe it says a great deal about art making in general, whatever part of the world you come from. And I use it as a sort of background to a lot of my thinking and feeling about what I'm doing as an artist. We know only two realities, the one around us, the one within us. The first reality is the universe. The second is the life of the psyche. Communication from the first to the second is affected through the senses in the messages which they register, while communication from the second to the first is made through action, action which enables us to project our forces into the outside world and to observe the consequences. But even if the two realities are thus brought together, there remains an irreducible disparity between them. That which is around us disposed in space, and that which is within us as unfolds and is felt in time. There lies perhaps the main mystery of the world, the impossible abyss which separates the two sides, the side where the self lives and the opposite, the side where the other extends. Yet man, humans, have discovered the means by which the two sides may merge together in a most subtle way. And this is in the work of art, for he, she projects and inserts into the very substance of his inner life, which thus becomes inscribed in space as both image and object, perceptible to others. And although this work of art is made up of materials and dimensions borrowed from the outside world, it reflects images born of sight and memory that show the world transformed. Thus, the work of art, far from being an ornament, a fanciful addition to the reality, lies at the heart and mystery of being. This is amongst the first paintings I saw when I was a young man. I was born in 1956 in Cambridge. My father was finishing his PhD there and moved to become a geography in political and human geography at Bristol University when I was about 3 years old. And he loved art. He was a serious practicing amateur artist, but was a very good artist of watercolor. But he had landscape books aplenty in the house. And this is one of the first paintings I saw. It's The Isle of Dead by Arnold Berkelin. And what it remained for me in my mind as a power of an image to haunt one in the most beautiful way. What actually was it I was looking at? To me, it was very, very entrancing. I was worried by it. I was anxious about it, but I was drawn towards it. And I discovered it was one of 12 versions of a painting called The Isle of the Dead, which Berkelin, a painter in late 1800s in Switzerland, had painted in memory of the husband of a countess who had lost her husband after many years of life together. And this was a painting in memorial for him. He did several versions of it. And here we have this character moving into the darkness. And this is part of what I want to touch on today, vis-a-vis the East and the West. The darkness, which in Western sort of culture, Christian or Abrahamic tradition cultures, has associations of mystery, uncertainty, and doubt, and anxiety. But in this case, it's the place of the unknown. And painting, I realized, could be about things which were mysterious. One of my other great loves of my father's, I inherited his love for certain painters, was Turner, who most of you will know, one of the most important painters, certainly from Britain and within Europe in the late 19th century. And this painting was one of his later works when he moved from being rendering the real world. He could paint with an almost identical photographic memory. Architecture he was very fond of. Many of you would have seen his Venetian paintings, but on his journey as an artist, he moved away from the physical certainty of objects in the world and began to explore the idea of the immaterial. He was not a sort of church-going Christian, but he was, to my mind, a Christian mystic, one who sought the greatest depths of the idea of the infinite and the divine, and mostly in the natural world. In this painting, which is Rain, Steam and Speed, what I like about Turner was he was dealing with the idea of the eternal as well as with his present. His present was the age of the Industrial Revolution. In many cases, Turner's paintings are actually portraits of the polluted world caused by industrialization. The blazing sunsets, etc., were either from volcanic eruptions or from, in Northwestern Europe, from burgeoning industrialism. But in this painting, we see the train. I'm going to get up to this point. This, you can't, I can do it here, sorry. It's very difficult. I need to go back here. I didn't need to get up, sorry. So the train here has a firebox on the front, which is ridiculous. The train firebox is inside the train, but this is a metaphor for the evil of industrialization, the unending power of the industrial. Down here is a choir of angels, and here is a group of fishermen. So here in this scene, Turner paints the supernatural and the real world. And if you take the lines up from the bridge, we have the atmosphere of the infinite coming down to the terrestrial, this dark form coming out of that mystery into the light of the day. And what he's doing is creating this sense of an actual spiral or circular motion, which is creating visual tension. So for me, I thought, here's somebody who can depict realistically and paint with equal clarity what we would later call abstract or ambiguous. Another one of my favorite paintings of many, but this is Constable, the great painter of skies. And skies have always been interesting to me. Horizons have always been interesting to me. And thus the landscape has always been of interest to me. I like bodies. I have one. I've painted them. I've done things with them in terms of their artistic possibilities to quite a high degree. But what they took me to was various forms of abstraction. In the landscape, I realized the landscape is a unique event in human experience. It's our environment, its structure, and its time. My father, as a geographer, helped me understand that aspect of the natural world. Constable's other kind of painting, which is quintessential English landscape painting, has many traditional European values in it, light, dark, his love for the natural world. But what I want you to start thinking about, and I don't want to get too complex, but they're important for this discussion, is the idea that in the Western world, by which I mean, for the sake of discussion, the cradle of Western civilization being the Western Mediterranean. Prior to the beginning of Renaissance, art that was in that region was dominated by the Byzantine, which had a very distinct form of physical structuring of painting. What happens in the Renaissance is the confluence or the fusion of three different sensibilities. The first sensibility and awareness is the idea of ousia. There isn't an easy word to translate. I think China probably will have one. I need to do some research on that. But it's the idea of the realm of reality within which all may be possible or experienced. So ousia is the umbrella experience. Painting then is within ousia, the moment of phenomena, appearance, through which we see, perspectiva. So painting at its origin in the West is this notion of the containment of energy, which is marked by something through which you see, not at which you look. And the beauty of that, I think, is very, very powerful. And it's something I found when I looked at Chinese and Japanese art for the first time for slightly different reasons, which I'll make clear. But what I want you to start thinking about is this idea of pictorial construction. Just to go back to the landscape, this is part of a prehistoric landscape near my hometown of Bristol in England. And my family, one side of my family comes from this landscape. They've been on that land for over 600 years. And so when I go there, I feel a special attachment to it. But this is markings, as there are all over the world, of our ancient forebears. And the ancient artists of the world made very large things or very small things, whatever culture you're in. Things of a certain size only happened at a certain point in time. Ancient art was really for those who were in control of the universe. Whatever your deistic understanding of physical structures, large objects, large artworks went to communicate those that brought water, light, rain, wind, and all the things that made life possible. Small things were given between those as signs of affection or regard, an amulet or a monument. But as we develop in terms of the evolution of painting, we begin to understand we have a spatial relationship. We spend our time, all cultures, in and on the land. That is our abode. And I want you to think about this in general. How we see is this way. Just bear that in mind. People look at ancient art and go, why are there so many circles in ancient art? Why were they so fascinated? Because this is how we see. There is no this, unless you have to put your glasses on. We see this way. Anything else is a kind of intrusion into how we physically see. So that said, we've got the idea that we're in space, and what happens is we begin, at some point, animal control, like husbandry and agriculture, we started to begin to have a control of nature. Now, in indigenous cultures and in ancient cultures such as China, that relationship was harmonic. We work with what is there. But in the West, we are in control of it. No, you are in relationship to it, but you choose to be controlling it. That brings with it all sorts of problems, like now we have global climate change because people are in the natural world. Anyway, we have to say the landscape is our first abode, and then we have structures which begin to separate. This is, I'm showing this landscape because this was part of my youth growing up. This is a place in the Welsh Hills. It's an ancient 300-year-old cottage. It has no electricity. One faucet brings water into the house from a well on the hill. And basically, I go back to the 17th century when I go up there. I drive up in a 20th century vehicle and I park it, and then I live like a 19th century person. It's great. And all I hear is the wind and the birds, and there's no electricity of any kind. I burn, wood fires to cook things, and I live a very different life. But I get back into synchronicity with the natural world. It's a very important part of my life. The tree here, I'm just showing you this because when I learned from my father about feng shui and the idea of wind, water, and divination, my father's interest was in Chinese population and human development through the history of the country. He never went there. He went to Hong Kong and Taiwan in the last years of his life, but he never went to mainland China. And I shared my experience going there. I've been going there since the late 90s. And I was talking to an old farmer who used to be on this land, and I was telling him about feng shui, and he was like, whoa, that's very interesting. And I said, well, he said, but he thought about it. He was smoking his pipe, and he said, we have that here. And I said, do we have feng shui in Wales? He goes, yes. I said, what? He said, look at this. And this tree was planted. This is heavily pollard because it was getting very big. It's a 400-year-old tree. It was planted, he said, when the house was built to ward off the effects of the devil. In the next sequence, there was these ash trees around the house. There were a pentangle, 5 trees. And he said they were planted to ward off witchcraft. So he was right. The people who made that landscape were aware of the supernatural forces of the world as well as the physical ones. So in a sense, it was a kind of version of feng shui, and it was an understanding of energies that are visible and invisible that control the universe. So in my early landscape days, I started off, I was okay, at school in general, but I veered towards the art. So I love painting and drawing. I just, felt very comfortable doing it. And my parents and my art teacher particularly encouraged me. So I started painting and oil painting. This is one I did when I was about 18. It's not a very good photograph. The painting was not nicer than the photograph, but it shows my interest. And what I'm really doing, as my father said, you're painting where earth meets heaven or paradise or whatever term you want. The sky and infinity is what you're really interested in, and the light. And I said, yes. So then I see my first Chinese painting, and it's a book of fan paintings or album paintings, such as this one. And I realized, I was saying to one of visitors earlier, the shape of things become really critical to me, because I've been used to this all my life, the square and the rectangle. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing things which have a floating energy to them. And in the painting, I'm looking at this and I think, well, half of it's not even filled in. What does that mean? But it's very interesting to me. I think this is Ma Yuan, but it's the Southern Song Dynasty. Then Fan Quan was a painting I saw much later. And when I saw this, I realized that my sense of landscape was probably going to change forever. Because firstly, when I looked at this and I thought, there's a magnificence to this, but the mountain is the power of the mountain is softened by virtue of the light that plays at the bottom in the form of mist. So that otherwise kind of very phallic, powerful object is transformed by the energy, which may be female or otherwise. It's yin yang. And when I realized, as I studied it at Oxford, I had a chance to study with the keeper of Asian art, who explained to me, looking at scroll paintings and other paintings, the sort of symbolism in much of Chinese painting, which is, of course, a very long history and which I'm just beginning to understand the complexities of. But what he pointed out to me was the idea, in part, this idea of absorption. And I didn't really fully understand until about 20 years ago what he really meant. I thought I understood. But his point was, when a Chinese artist in this tradition is painting, they're painting, as you know, on silk or paper primarily. Again, unusual in the West unless you're a watercolorist. And when they paint, there's a kind of separation that happens between the moment of painting and the space that they're working in. It's a very powerful connection. And what I realized, in the West, we prepare our canvases. Once painting came off the walls, put onto canvases or panels, we make panels, we put canvas on them. That's the substrate. Then we put gesso on, which is a surface. Then we paint that. And it's a beautiful, delicate surface, but it's layering away from the substrate. Chinese painting connects directly to what is carrying the image. Fundamentally, you go into that space. So that, first of all, was very exciting to me. The more I saw of these things was this realization that the sort of mystique of black and white was much more subtle in that there's, I understand it, the 5 tones of black, amongst many other things, which are colors denoted by the source of the ink, gives temperatures which are warmish black or coolish black. So when a Song Dynasty painting was completed, after, rather than being seen thousands of years later, its subtleties will be much more evident, but they were there. Then the idea of scrolls and hanging scrolls and screens became very interesting to me, because in ancient cultures of the world, you would bring in images in the form of fabrics and or carpets, to where nature would come in to the inside. Nature would be brought in from the inside. So as we stopped moving in a natural relationship to time and space, and we built structures, we made doors and windows through which we entered and exited. That's the beginning of what we're looking at now. Formats everywhere. Our phones, our TVs, everything is formatted. This is at odds with how we actually exist in time and space. So painting, I thought, could be an account of that. Then I saw the massive screens, and I was talking to a fellow guest and a writer here this evening about the role of the 3 perfections: painting, poetry, and calligraphy. And in the West, there's been a lot of talk about word and text, and there's a very definite tradition of that in terms of contemporary art. But you go back to China, to Iran, and other ancient cultures, that plurality has been alive for a long time, the combination of the power of word structures. But what I began to realize when we go to calligraphy, particularly in China and Japan, is that what it started out of was pictographic. But in the West, we did images in caves, and then at some point we started writing, but they never joined. The only word in English language that denotes drawing and writing is graphic. It's the only term where those things actually meet. They're always separated. But for me, looking at Chinese painting, and then by extension Japanese, there is a synthesis here between what is seen as visual and what is seen as linguistic. So writing and the indication of promulgation of language in relationship to visuality is synthesized in a unique way. So I went to Huanshan in about 1998, went up on we cheated. Instead of walking up the mountain like you're supposed to do if you're a devotee, we didn't have time. We took the modern way up in a floating gondola, but we went through a white mountainscape, and all of a sudden the clouds parted and we started to see this. And my students were like, it's like a Chinese landscape. And I said, well, it is a Chinese landscape. You know, they're not painting myth, but it was a wonderful, simple response. But it really was, it has this feeling of the delicacy and power all at once. The grandeur and the softness of the movement of air and moisture. It was absolutely fantastic. So I want to contrast for a minute. This is Li Tang. I've put various versions of the painting this painting, but for the sake of discussion, the scroll painting is the idea of the immortal, but what I want you to do is look at the figure in space, which in the West would be Superman or something like, but in China was a notion, an idea of a Taoist person seeking the notion of the immortal status. And here you have this idea where nature is the arena within which the human is exploring a possible well-being. Though some years earlier, some years later, I should say, Caspar David Friedrich makes this painting where this individual is clearly not a mountaineer, nor is he a shepherd or a country person. He's a civilized urban person who is now standing in the landscape, looking at and really looking down on the landscape. He's above the clouds, which often Chinese painting gives a suggestion of. Very rare to have this aerial view in Western painting. He begins this process. In classical terms, his triangle is to do with the ascension, which is the Christian, and also stability. He's in darkness. Light, in this instance, is the place where the divine will be found. His head is breaking the horizon. He is connecting to the infinite. He's not yet in it. Often Friedrich will paint women who are higher up nearer the sky than the men, because they were smarter. He knew that. But in this instance, he's got, in all seriousness, this is a person who's trying to have a sense of contemplation of where he is in time and space and the infinite, the immeasurable. But I like the contrast of the two paintings because they speak to a similar kind of notion of where we are with our bodies in time and space, literally and metaphorically. So I'm now going to show you, this is just it's a still from a film, which is a ghost story written by an American writer. It's The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, set in England. I saw this film when I was about 10. And as a result, I couldn't look out of the window at night for about 12 years because I'd see this man's face. You know, I couldn't wash up. I used my excuse. I got out washing up in the winter for the same reason. My mother said, that film's long gone. You've got to start getting back to reality. But this film is about this beautiful ghost story. It's not a horror film, and it's a very subtle film, which is about psychology. But in it, various characters appear that are ghosts, so they become visible. And the idea of the supernatural, or that which is beyond the realms of the everyday, is something which occupies my mind a lot. And I like the idea of what ghosts might be. What interests me is they're often portrayed in terms of their evil status. And I don't quite understand that, because most people aren't evil. So why, when they pass away, did it become so? So this idea of, just the idea of another nature of existence becomes interesting. Now back to my own evolution in terms of imagery. So I've got the landscape offering. And then when I go to art school for the first time, I start off with all the traditional Western things. We do the cast drawings from Greek and Roman sculptures. I copy original drawings by Leonardo, Matisse, Dürer in the drawing school. I actually draw from the masterpieces themselves. They put them on there. They checked to see if you had ink on you, and you could only have certain types of eraser because the drawing was right there, no glass. So I'm looking at Leonardo as near as the screen is and drawing. For 2 hours every week for 2 years, I did that. And that was one of their ways to get you to understand what your forebears did. Anyway, while I was at school, I was forced to do sports, which I never liked. I didn't mind exercising, but playing ball games meant nothing to me. I wasn't interested in them. It seemed like a waste of time. So one day I'm playing rugby in a sleet storm, and I thought, this is ridiculous. So I put the ball down, and I said to the instructor, I'm not playing this anymore. He said, pick up that ball. And I said, no, no, no. And so I said to the headmaster the next day, because I was generally well behaved, and this was like aberrant behavior. So I said to the headmaster, I don't want to play rugby anymore. He said, would you be interested in another kind of sport? I said, yes. What might it be? In comes my art teacher, Jerry, who I've been working with for a year, who was a judoka. He did judo. He was a black belt. He took me to the dojo, gave me a gi. I did it up. He told me from the beginning, I said, what is this fighting? He said, it's wrestling, but judo means gentle way. Now, it's not always gentle, but that's the idea. And do goes back to da. So, karate, way of the empty hand, taekwondo, way of the hand and foot. So everything's going back to China slowly. I think, China's looming always in the background here. But this was my moment to come across a particular form of fighting. And my teacher said, this is about how you use energy. Think of it as chess and ballet meeting together. And so once I started reading it, I thought, this is fantastic. I loved it. I was inside, no rain. It was warm. And then I could do these moves, which I had to think about and like strategically using a chess-like mentality, forecasting how my opponent might move. Anyway, it was really energy. So I got further and further into it. I thought, this is great. So when I moved eventually to Oxford to study there, I went back to the judo class for the first time in 2 years. I'd given up judo, and I was extremely uncomfortable the next day because I was getting too old for this. I thought there's got to be another form of fighting I can do that would be interesting. And karate, Shotokan karate is what I chose. So I did Shotokan karate. When I was doing that, I was studying the human form as a moving entity. And as I looked at the moving form, both dancing and in the martial arts, I became fascinated with the seeming dematerialization of form as it moves. So your hand is 5 fingers, then how many is it? Movement is a dematerialization process. And I thought in terms of painting, how can I bring together this idea of the body, like painting from the body, not about the body? And then I looked at Chinese painting and I thought, if I look at Chinese painting and Western art, we're going to see some very different things. So this is beginning to come into my mind. Studying the martial arts and really understanding body movement helped me think about the choreography of mark making in terms of painting. So I did my first semi-abstract painting based on a kata. Kata is a Japanese term, form, pattern, or design you do in karate, where you do a series of movements set to a timer and a certain beat. So it's very regulated, but you have to improvise within it to a certain level. This is my first large oil painting of beeswax, and it was 9 feet by 4.5. It was a monster painting for me. I was so excited. It's like a mural. It was absolutely wonderful, but liberating. Then I moved from there to more severely reduced forms, and I started to abbreviate some of that energy. And this is now when I'm in town, when I'm away from the country. My landscapes are in my head, and I'm doing these judo paintings, and then these more abstract paintings, which are based on movements of the figure, which I explored in terms of miniature sculpture, about this big. These are all based on karate movements, and I wanted to formulate them into structures and really think about the idea of space, movement, and time. Moving away from the English landscape, I had an opportunity to travel to France when I was young, and I went to Santorini, of the Greek, one of the great Greek isles, the home supposedly of Atlantis, if you go back into Greek myths, a profoundly beautiful part of the world. My first experience of volcano and volcanic landscape. And it had a deep imprint on me because in this place, there's this idea of chronos and kairos in Greek, Greek thinking. Chronology is to do with time, hours, minutes, things we do in a certain set time. Kairos is a far more subtle sense of deep time, where you have a moment of reverie, where sometimes all of a sudden we're not here and now anymore, we're suspended somewhere else, some moment of magic, and we move out of the continuum. And that I think is very interesting. And I began to realize painting, again, looking at China and Japan, is about time as much as it is about space. So I'm flying back one summer to the UK, having taught somebody from various people from the Middle East, all of whom were involved in Persian miniature traditions. And they were working in modern idioms, but they were working with this technique. And I thought about their work. Then I thought about the Western canon. So here we are in the West. This is a Zubram painting, and it's, I think it's Serato, it's in the San Serratos, the martyrdom. In the West, I realized, flying back, if you think about the Mediterranean as a separation point geographically in the world, and you take a north-south line and you go from that line to all points to the West, everything pictorially is shadow bound, bodies in space lit by light, fixed in time. You go in the easterly direction, across what we call the Middle East and the West, to the Far East, right the way off the coast of California, but not onto it, it's shadow free. Shadows in the form of shadow play are very common in Asia, but shadows as the concretization of form are of no interest for the most part. Why? We see the same word, light falls on things. Why do Middle Eastern painters? It's a generalization, not an absolute fact. So please, I'm not trying to make a point other than how generally cultures see things differently. And I thought the Abrahamic traditions, Muhammad, Judaism, Christianity, have a theocratic God. God makes the world, and we exist within it in relation to other things that God has made. There's an architect. You go to China, you have Taoism, an impersonal cosmic order, no maker, being a nothingness, the void from which we emerge, within which we then exist in an extended sense, to which we may return. It's a kind of exhalation through space and time. Nothing's fixed, nothing's separated out. So I looked at that and then started looking at Chinese and Japanese philosophies and writings, and I read this idea of a flowing continuum within Asian culture, which is so different from the Western idea of structuring. And I realized that in painting, the notion of light and play is a concretization of the world. And in the West, in art, from more or less the beginning of time until probably the beginning of the 14th century, painters worked towards the body. In China, for the large part, they worked from the body into space. The painting moved into space rather than towards bodies. Bodies are painted in China. They hold a whole different sense of significance for the most part than they do in the West. So I started looking, as I then explored modern painting. This is Ashar Gorky, one of my heroes of the modern era, a painter who managed to create a relationship to the figural and the unconscious and the mythological and the psychosensual and psychospiritual and philosophical all at one point. When asked by many people about his colors, historically, people who was lack of colors, people talked to the idea that drawing for him was the quickest way toward a process of optimism, of arriving at a point of visual realization. He looked at the real world, he lived in the real world, but he was speaking to what lies beyond, what is clearly visible. There's the optical reality and there's the psychic reality, and how they separate or how they unify is part of the role of an artist to explore. Roberto Matta, another painter of the unconscious and mythical, becomes something which is very important in my work, as I try to move beyond what I call surface morphologies into the underlying nature of it. And this idea of consciousness being archived, because what I began to realize that painting, through looking at Chinese painting and how time is accrued for, the scroll is not meant to be seen fully extended. We know that it's a function of museum, so we can see the whole thing. But in the original idea, be they hand scrolls or larger, they're meant to be seen section by section from the right to the left, not right, left to right. So that orientation made me realize, okay, a lot of this stuff has to do with geography, spiritual and philosophical basis. How can we kind of talk to each other through art? One of the most important cinema artists or cinematic artists is Andrei Tarkovsky, who to me is one of the most philosophical and spiritual of filmmakers. He's within the realm of Christian mysticism, but he speaks to a kind of metaphysical nature of being, which I find very, very appealing. And he helps me understand moving beyond the surface realm into greater depth. So my own work, I traveled to various landscapes. I have done a fair amount of travel, not as much as I like, but I went obviously came here to America. The landscape here, as you all know, is pretty dramatic. And for me, it was extremely exciting to see this. Then I went to Iceland, which if you haven't been, I highly recommend. Extraordinary landscape. Saw my first icebergs and glaciers. So the actual machines of the earth, which are, the universe is, in terms of physics, is the sun and the ice caps and the winds that they produce. That's what keeps us alive, that trio. When that's disrupted, things start to go wrong. But being in that primal landscape was extremely powerful to me. So I started making paintings, and I've always hovered between being referential or representational or being abstract. And these terms, for me, any act of art is a form of abstraction. A painting of your beloved or your favorite, aunt is as abstract as a Mark Rothko. They're different degrees, but anything that once you make a mark, you are removing it from an original status of being. But what I was interested in was the role of what we call images. Images are things which had another life, which are then reiterated. What I began to realize with painting is if you, like the Chinese artists, would go to the landscape, and unlike a Western artist where they draw in situ, beautifully or otherwise, they take notes. Chinese artists, my understanding, went with their bodies and mind, interacted with that energy, went back to a place of work and started to make images, which are about the experience of landscape, not what it looked like, not even what it felt like. It was actually a form of resonance with Tao. It was a form of connecting to mystical states of being. Now, there are lots of political aspects to literati paintings and other things. We can romanticize from the West, which is the one I want to be careful of. But when I've been in the presence of those paintings, whatever knowledge you have, the paintings still have presence. And what they taught me was the subtlety of what can be done with so little compared to what is done a lot in the West with a lot. And, you know, there's no right or wrong here. There's different ways of operating. So for me, when I saw, you know, the work of the Chinese artists, I realized they're painting the landscape and they're painting the psychic realm. It's not just a place you go to. It's a state of mind and how you feel about something. So I started, and then I started to look again, going back to the Chinese. Ming is obviously exploring the tradition of the hanging vision of paintings. He's doing them, you know, putting Schwan paper onto canvas, so he's melding east and west literally, and with his ink flow painting, he's producing his energy fields. And I'm trying to do something in my own way, not dissimilar, but in my case, I want to use, in this case, as I say, most of my paintings are on unprimed canvases. I use acrylic paint, so I don't have to worry about archival aspect, because oil paint is the only thing that will hurt a canvas. This is why you put a substance on it like gesso. But with acrylic painting, I can paint directly into the surface. That gives me a contact. So there's no intermediary between the thing that's going to carry the painting, like the surface of gesso, and the painting itself. So when I saw, with a permission in China, a Chinese artist who I'd been working with in Western painting techniques, do a bird and flower painting, I asked her if I could watch it, because I knew I'd done enough calligraphy to know it's extremely difficult and it's a lifelong pursuit, but it has a very special way of being. So, and I was complimented by some on my efforts. I was very happy, but I realized this is a long road to take. So I watched an expert, or a burgeoning expert. I watched her, and she took the paper, was there on the felt. She ground the ink. She put the brush in, and she was breathing. She held the brush a certain way. It came towards the paper, and I was looking with bated breath. I thought, something's going to happen beyond the obvious. And when she put the brush down onto the paper, it was absorbed into space. I thought, oh, energy in space, not marks on surface. So the West, we construct up this way. We build up to suggest space. But going back to that idea of two pyramids. So in Western linear perspective, you had inner depth and you have the realm that you're in as a spectator. They talk about the window. You want to imagine the window plane is containing all the elements inside. So there's a picture that stops here. We're out here, the picture starts here, and we go into it. Two pyramids meet on the surface of the painting. Chinese painting does not have that separation. Japanese print and painting does not have that separation. It's an immersion, and merging of you and the space presented by the artist to move into. It's invitational. So Western art is based on a certain, up to the beginnings of abstraction, and you know, Cubism ends that dominance. Western art then changes, looking to the East and other cultures to try new forms of spatial exploration. Another film's important, and films are very important to me because they're a very powerful modern art form. I make tiny videos to, you know, satisfy myself in terms of playing with a moving image. But when you see a real film, something magical happens. And this is Lost Horizon. So by a British writer, and the idea is a group of people, American and British, are escaping China in a state of early eruption in World War II, and they're being taken by, I think, a rescue plane away back toward Europe. But they crash because they're flying in the morning. They realize they're flying into the Himalaya, not away from it. Say, but why are we going in this direction? Mystery, mystery, mystery. The person flying them is kidnapping them. And they land, they crash, and everybody survives. One person dies, and it's the pilot. And then they sit there, and in the film, it's about 1930s. It's a very, very one. I recommend everybody see it. It's a fantastic film. But at one point, this person comes who's a lama. And he comes, he speaks perfect English, and explains to them they've landed and they're going to be taken to a place of safety. So they go, and I watched this when I was about 10, it was magical. And they go over this blowing landscape into this valley, Shangri-La, and there is utopia. The sky is beautiful, there's no storms, people are happy working, there's food, there's animals, people seem very happy. And there's this fantastic structure, which is right here, this brilliant structure, which is where the abbot lives. The abbot is both Christian and Buddhist, a very interesting kind of mix. It's kind of Christian-Buddhist mixing of the idea of an ideal world. Anyway, I won't tell you more, but the visuals in it are fantastic. Like also Black Narcissus, which is another film where the East meets the West in a, you know, without being patronizing or stereotypical. I think it does a pretty good job of respectfully looking from a Western perspective of culture through the prism of spiritual and religious lenses. Black Narcissus is incredible. These images here are all based on paintings made on glass, which I thought was a lovely idea in those days before the digital. Artists were working on glass to produce these images of landscapes. I went to the Himalaya and I did a base camp trek to Everest in 2002. I was still young enough to do it without struggling. And I'm so glad I did it because it was life-changing. And this is Chola, which is a famous pass. You go from one just past the base of Camp of Everest, rather on the last trip of your phase to get to the base camp. This is about 18,000 feet. So you're not breathing too deeply, but you are very close to this idea of whatever your sense of maybe paradise or purity. The air is pure, the temperature is cool, but not too cold. And at this moment that I'm standing here looking around me, I suddenly had this realization. It was a quiet moment. And I started to feel very upset. My brother died when I was 38. He was 38, I was 35. He had a very rare cancer, very young. It was mystery and horrible. And he was gone, my only sibling. And I were very, very close to him, as I am to his son, who luckily is very much alive. I'm going to see in about a month's time. But I was thinking about my brother, wishing Nick could be with me, but he was in spirits. I knew that. And then a failed marriage, which is not what I planned and broke my heart many years ago. And I was an emotional wreck for a few minutes in this beautiful place, sobbing. And then within seconds of that, I realized this. I breathed a little more deeply, and I looking at this space, and I thought, oh, everything is all right. This actually, all of that, it matters, but it's relative. My brother will always matter. My ex-wife will always matter, but I can now place it somewhere. It's not here, just behind. It's in its own place. But what I realized was time was becoming eternal and space was becoming infinite. And I thought, oh, this is why I've come on this trip, to have this experience. And it's a blessing. And I felt very, very moved by it, to say the least. And what I realized was that's what I want to try to inject into my paintings. If I get them right, there's going to be some sense of a moment of an opening that occurs for people who see the work. So again, looking to systems of pictorial structure, the mandala, which is fairly universal, but very prevalent in India, Native American culture, as well as obviously China, Tibet, and many other countries. And at its most abstract is a recognition of the role of the cosmic as being part of human experience. And this was one of the most beautiful astronomical projections I've seen in the mandalic form. But the very idea of where we are, the axis, the idea of how a mandala is really a tool for understanding spiritual growth and development as a visual form and has great power. And this idea, images and certain experiences carry great power. So here's my trip. This is the base camp of Everest, where, there's Everest up here. The surrounding peaks are just magnificent. It was looking like this when I was there. It was March, so the snow was high, but there was also areas exposed of the glacier you're actually standing on. But for me then, this was my roof of the world experience, and it was a deeply moving one. So I started making paintings, when I make my paintings, I don't have a real intention other than beginning something. And the beginning something is a state of mind. I usually play music. Sometimes I watch a film, but I don't really watch it. I hit like Lost Horizon because the language is so beautiful. It deals with so many philosophical things, puts me into a certain frame of mind. These paintings about 5 by 6 foot, so about the size of most of these ones here, on muslin. And again, I use acrylic mediums on raw canvas or muslin, and then I stain them with ink, and then I let the image develop. And I'm interested in the idea of spontaneity and improvisation as a form of developing an image. And once I begin to have experience with it, then I begin to identify it as having certain properties, and I begin to add things, and I allow things to happen. Like in here, on the screen, you can't really see this, but you can see it later when I'll show it to you live. It's really almost photographic, which is not intended, but it looks like, oh, that's mountains. And I was saying to somebody earlier, I'm interested in the idea of alluding to something, but not the illusion of it. So I don't want, if you see a mountain or anything in there that you find intriguing, that's fine. Just don't tell me what it is. You can, think about it, but don't tell me, please. Because I had one student, I did a 17-foot diptych. I was very happy with it. I'd spent several months on it. Took my students, as I often do, the end of the classes to come to my studio for a day trip. And this one woman walked in, she said, oh, I love this painting. I said, thank you. I love the unicorn. I went, oh. What she had done is taken all the scale from my painting, which was supposed to be cosmic or micro, and now there was a bloody horse running over the landscape with a horn on its head, and I had to repaint the whole painting. So, I do want, in all seriousness, as I say to people, if my paintings are working and they're equivalent to a plane flight, I want you to be at the airport in takeoff mode, not landing, because you have to land it. As Duchamp said, the audience completes the work. An art piece has no life until it's seen and beheld by somebody, and we'll all see different things, but hopefully you'll be taken to certain kinds of spaces. Each of us will bring a different experience. And these are not abstract to me, they're abstracted, and they're related to what I call real life, which is as much with my eyes shut as with them open. And that's an important resource for me. Sometimes I deal with the idea of geography. This is very much a painting about part of Wales that I know well. In that it inspired it after I've been there and was back in California. And I realized again, the history of landscape painting is really about the history of when the literati and others painted landscape, it wasn't for themselves so much, it was them back to people in cities, the growing urban spaces where landscapes really existed. People living in landscapes didn't really need to see them. They were living them. So painting is often, everything you see in this room, they're present in one form, but their consciousness is otherwise absent. When you see a direct relation of a figure, then it's definitely absent. So painting is often related to the idea of absence as it pretends to be present, and that's its beauty, that's its myth. So for me, as I work with forms, I really sometimes want to be very reductive. I really envy minimalist artists. There's something about the work I find enormously compelling, but I can't do it. I do it and I think, I gotta have something. I like incidents. I like something to occur. It doesn't have to be hugely complex, but I want it to be some kind of event. So that's what I tend to work on, is the idea of divisions. And I take the idea of the horizon and I simply shift it. I had this incredible experience in a aerobatic aircraft. A student of mine, older student and a husband, invited me to their home in the Sierra foothills. And was chair of the department back in the 90s. I was working pretty hard and they said, you need a break. So they took me up there to their lovely home. And they took me, the next morning, a gentleman came to the door and he put me in, got in the car, drove to an aerodrome, and he opened the door and there was a biplane. And he said, what do you think that is? I said, it's a biplane. He said, yes. He said, what do you think it's for? I said, I hope it's for aerobatic flying. He said, yes. So he gives me a jumpsuit and he said, this is your safety lesson. I'm going to fly you up into the sky. We're going to do lots of weird things. And hopefully you're not going to throw up. And then when you do that, if anything happens, I'll swear once. And within 4 seconds, you'll be fired out of the plane. And when you're in the sky, pull anything red you see. And I went, okay. And my friend said, oh my God, that's his safety lesson. I said, this is fantastic. So up I went, sat in there with my suit and my red tags, hoping I wouldn't have to pull them. And off we went. And within minutes, we were circling through. I could see the Sierras, the Pacific Ocean. We were out going up and up, up. I didn't throw up. I was beyond ecstatic. Like, it was on the intercom because it's very loud. And he said, do you want to do something really thrilling? And I said, well, this is great. What else can we do? He said, well, what we can do is turn off the engine. I said, sounds great. I'm up for it. As I said it, I thought, this may not be the smartest move. But anyway, I could trust him. He said, what we're going to do, I'm going to give you G-forces, first of all. So he started banking. And he said, you know what, I said, I know what G-forces are, but at the moment I'm driving a 20-year-old VW Buck. So I don't have experience them directly. He said, you're about to. So we started banking. And he said, breathe normally. And slowly I started losing vision. As we went to 6.5 feet, and I thought, wow, and I felt like I was about 20 feet long, no pain. I thought, whoa, this is fantastic. It's wonderful. And I was like, but I wasn't seeing. I thought, I'm losing my sight. So he said, now, if you're a mother, you're having a child, the thing you're not, you're passing the largest, of your life. Bear down. So I got my sight back. He said, this is it. All you have to do. So we're going to go up, I'm switching off the engine, and then we'll see what happens. I said, great. Up we go. Engine goes off, the plane starts, and I'm in the front seat, member, so the ground is coming up. I thought, whoa, it's fantastic. But to me, I thought, this is cubism. I'm now in multiple spaces, and so this is art happening in real life. It was magical. And so I'm plummeting to the earth, and I was thinking about, dying of cancer or getting run over by a bus, and I thought, this is the best way to go, I don't care. And at that point, he fired up the engine, and at that point, he came out, and I was going, and we banked out. And he said, I said, oh, can you do that again? He said, no. He said, you're going to have the biggest hangover of your life tomorrow. All that blood work you've done. So anyway, I said, well, how do real pilots do it? They have compression suits. So the top pilots, the suits know what they're about to go through. They compress the body so they don't have to do that. Anyway, I came down to earth, and I'm still not sure I'm down on earth because it's seared into my psyche. It's like a tattoo of experience. And I thought, I want this kind of dynamic, this liberation from gravity to be part of. Again, going back to Chinese art in particular, certain aspects of the landscape, is this idea of a floatingness, an idea of a suspension rather than the concrete adhesion to the earth. So there, Ming and I started these lecture series in China. This started, I think it was the first one, 94, but this is 96 in Shanghai. And this was amazing experience. Ming was trying to introduce acrylic paintings to Chinese art students. So we went to Lushan Academy, Central Academy, Beijing, Jiaozheng, now the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou. And he would speak and I would paint. And then I would talk and he would translate and I would make these paintings in situ. When we first discussed it, it was going to be an audience no bigger than this. And I thought, that's fine. And as we got nearer the day, I could see people were coming up to it and said, he said, maybe 100. Then the day before, maybe 200. I thought, oh. So on the day we go to the gallery and it's a bit like this. And it was full of people. And I was supposed to be doing performance. I said, I can't. He said, the director said, we can't do this. There's too many people. They shut us down. So we had to go to the auditorium. We had 1,000 people. And I'm doing these paintings. And every time I did something, they all got up and cheered like I made this stuff. It was fantastic. But for them, what was exciting, they were seeing this material because China had this paint before, but it, as Jinghua was explaining, it was going out to the West. Their home brands that they were available to them, Maries, was not good quality. So this stuff was good, but it was too expensive for Chinese at that point because of the economics. Things have changed, as you well know, over the last 20, 30 years. But we've been doing these projects and then we've done workshops for up to 2 weeks. I did one workshop with a colleague and we did a figurative session where I was his TA and I did an abstract, section in the Central Academy. And that was 1999, I think. It was very hot. It was the humidity, if you don't, well, most of you do know, but for me, I hadn't been in humidity. I'm from England. It was like grief. It was like 200% humidity and 100 degrees. And, I was on one place, we went in Sichuan and we did a project there. And I gessoed the canvases the night before. And the next morning they were wetter than when I put them on. And the Chinese came out with their hair dryers, they cleaned off, they blew air out. So after an hour I could paint on them. But it was great because the students were seeing material which they'd heard about, but they'd never seen in action. And that was what was really exciting. And we could give them samples, we could give them a try. But more recently we've gone there and they have the material. So we have very interesting projects over there. But what was extraordinary for me was at one occasion, because as you well know, Chinese students generally copy exactly what their teacher does in the academies. And so I had done a painting at the request of the academy as a sort of starting point. So I did this painting over 4 days and I called it an unfinished work. I put it up and had this fantastic translator. She was yeeping and she was just wonderful. She was a philosopher. Her English was better than mine. She was brilliant, but she would talk to me and she came to me, she said, Jeremy, you got to come upstairs. And I went upstairs into a room and there's 24 students. All the men had suits on, the women had dresses, and look, they're going to a ball. And I used to have art students, very messy, but these are very tidy, like bank managers. There were 24 versions of my painting, from this size to this big, immaculate. I thought, oh, it's just like an installation. I didn't have a camera because they were perfectly rendered in oil paint, what I'd done in acrylic. It was just, I thought, what can I teach these people? It's ridiculous. But, when we actually discussed it, and it really was entertaining, we realized, well, we got back to this idea, the language, abstraction, they can copy anything they see, but what they wanted to know is, what am I seeing? And when we talk, that's when they started. They said, your duty is, I give you possibilities, you run with them. So I can give you certain technical tips, but duplication is not the name of the game. I understand in your other way of learning, it can be, but in the West, we tend not to do that. We go to certain axioms, like life drawing is often like playing scales if you're learning music. Life drawing is a way of measuring your eye-hand coordination, color studies, but then you do your own work, Anyway, going to China gave me, obviously, the faculty and the students and the staff were just wonderfully embracing. So Ming and I did various projects. This is one we did together in Lushan, and he did his mounting paper on canvas, and then he worked with the Chinese, and I came in with acrylic. The idea of fusing the two languages, and to let them realize that, this, for me, it's very important that we, in this era of wanting to mix our cultures, it's important that we keep respect at the heart of it. Understand difference as we accept the possibility of fusion. Like any relationship, it has to be, the sovereign is important and the fusion is important. And so in this instance, we were having really adventurous artists. Well, what can acrylic do? Because ink has its own properties. Ink can be like ink, but it's generally more material. So you play with that idea of absorption as opposed to the skin, which the Western art tends to be. So we started to play with those possibilities. Dalian, China, just, made me think about landscape in a new way. Land spaces, the landscapes are as much an internal reality as they are an optical phenomena. So these paintings are really an exploration about the idea of something very primary. They're, again, functioning as I'm making them in a state of mind, which is as much emotional. I'm interested in what is spiritual as opposed to what is emotional, what is intellectual as opposed to what is intuitive. And as a painter, I'm obviously migrating through those territories fairly regularly. The Welsh landscape remains a very important part of my experience, where I first really encountered that idea of the line, the horizon, which again, like Ming's exploring too, we can turn that horizon upside down. My plane flight did that for me very powerfully. And so it's all relative where we are in terms of the landscape, the space we occupy, and how we exist. So these paintings were basically forms of meditation on space. I began to realize the dilemma of the edge, and whether you have an open painting, a fan painting, or a strong horizontal or otherwise scroll, you've got to deal with that edge. So I'm beginning to think, I was asked earlier what I might be doing next, and part of it will be the role of language. I want to understand more. The terms in Chinese art and Japanese are very unique. Spiritual resonance, li, various forms of being that I want to be in the work. So that I want to be informed by those states of mind and information as I make the paintings. But I want there to be a reference to what is seeable, whether it's through my mind's eye, my memory. I want it to be a meeting point between your imagination and mine. My job as an artist is to use my imagination to let you find the next stage of your imagination. That's where the connection begins to happen. So I was on a train one day and I thought, I wish it was foggy. So I just breathed on the window. I had fog. And it was this idea of where that surface is, the glass, in this case, the surface of the painting, and where the image is, within or here. So I started playing with that idea of reflectivity and where a painting is actually located. So here the landscape and paintings of the landscape are getting fused together. This was an accident in a camera. I took this and it worked out perfectly. It's like a strange fusion of 3 or 4 images. Then I took mirrors from my place in Wales, which are Victorian, and I put them into the landscape because they'd never been out of the house for 200 years. Now they were in space, reflecting what I was seeing around me. So the painting surfaces are done in very many thin layers and glazing in between to create depth. So I put microscopic layers of thin medium between that allow light to play and start to bounce around to give luminosity. A lot of my work was related to early experiments in printmaking. So I used paper, like Pomo used paper to ponce onto the surface and lift off to create textures random and then come back and brush back into them. Sometimes I use photographs and some of the small works of photographs, but nearly everything you're seeing in my part of the exhibition, with the exception 1 or 2, is all paint. And part of what I'm interested in too is this idea in Western art, we have basically an entry point. We have in classical Western painting, you have pathway and you have repoussoir, which are the wings, the trees and buildings, which form an entry point for the viewer. Those go back in 19th century, 17th century France to the opera house and the theater, where the same structures would have been applied. So it's like a language that went through theater, opera to painting. But what I'm interested in, look at Chinese painting, and Friedrich is one of the few who I think through Schopenhauer, who knew about Buddhism, was interested in the idea of less gravity. So in Friedrich's painting, you can only go in with your mind. You can't walk into his paintings. You can only fly into them or float into them. You cannot walk into them. And I don't want people to walk into my painting. They have to get away from their feet to move into the experience of the painting. These are all 6 by 5, 7 by 5, nothing too huge. But it's this idea of painting being a chronology, that idea of kairos as opposed to chronos, the idea of deep time as opposed to a moment, and the relation between those things. And in Chinese art too, this idea of forms in space, which it's identities rather than structures per se. They have structure in various types of application of brush, axe marks, etc. There's a very complicated history of Chinese lexicon, is very sophisticated in the painting styles. But for me looking at it, I want to look at the stuff which has the idea of how atmosphere functions. And atmosphere is that through which you see, not at which you look. So you move into the painting. I'm happy to show you after on, you can, these are, you know, this is not a way to see them, so I'll go through it again. I had an chance of exhibiting in my, part of my ancestry is Welsh, and there's a small museum in Tenby, which is a lovely museum where my grandmother came from. So I had a chance to be, these are my Welsh-based inspired landscapes. And it was wonderful showing there because people came who weren't used to seeing work like this, and they were very excited. So it was a good experience for me. I remind myself that I can be tidy. This is my studio, but if you came here today, you wouldn't recognize. So I've got to go back and tidy up my studio. But this is where I work in San Rafael. I have 2,400 square feet, and in the summer it only has a tin roof, has no heating. So in the summer I got 117 degrees last year. It was my hottest day. Great for losing weight. And so there's multiple directions for it, but it's, you know, I've got to, seeing this makes me feel very angry. I've got to go do some tidying up. I've been pretty busy during COVID. I loved lockdown because I was in my studio every day, zooming to my students and painting. So it's perfect. So of late, these are slightly older ones here. Let me go forward a little bit. This is actually owned by a Chinese guy who's living in Australia, but he responded to very strongly, and it was actually used on a book cover. A woman saw this and asked if she could use it for a book cover about, it's a story about a woman who'd gone through a very difficult life and was deeming herself by going redemption, going back into the landscape. And she felt this was a metaphor for her life. So I was happy to do that. So then coming to the end now, but these paintings are done on silk. And the silk I use a lot because I wanted to, without copying or mimicking, I wanted to look at what silk did. There's a British sinologist, Arthur Waley, who was a genius, I think, of Chinese. He understood Chinese language and literature and poetry and painting. He spoke of the deafening silence of Chinese painting, which I loved. Because for me, like doing this, when you do this to your ears and you hear yourself breathe, like when you put your head under the water in the bath, I always love that because you can hear your body. Not hearing that inside, and I wanted to get that feeling. So silk is that through which you paint. So I did acrylic painting, and I thought that's stage one. Now I'm going to cover it in silk, and I'm going to paint areas of it on top. So the middle part of this is basically raw silk over a painted area. The others are paint on top of the silk. And what that's done to me is given me many, many depths to the painting, which I'm very excited by. Then I painted one, and I thought, what if I tear the silk off? So I've done that, torn the silk off, and it leaves these fantastic marks. And it's rather like a silk screen process. So there's a great deal of density and subtlety in this piece, which I've been exploring more of. So one of the, other than the flight and obviously landscape visits, the Northern Lights have been a huge influence on my inner world. And so I started making paintings, which were attempts to create some of that energy, but then I discovered a new material called alcohol ink, which I'm going to be showing you a little bit of in a minute. They're coming up next. So these are the alcohol ink paintings. These are very strange materials. They're very, they're kind of expensive. They can't do very big at the moment, but you can photograph them and increase their size, which is what I'm doing. And now I've discovered a material which might allow me to do them on a larger scale. But what I love about them, this is one moving now. You have to cut, I've got to turn this around. I want you to see this. You're sitting right there. So it's actually moving. I'm filming it while it's being made. And that I've got many, the painting doesn't exist anymore. They usually disappear. But I'm capturing for up to 40 seconds the creation. And I'm making the painting by moving the space. I don't do this. I put medium on and I move the space. And that's very interesting to me. I'm painting using space to make the painting, not my hand to make energy in space. So it's a different way of functioning. And then this one is printed onto metal. So there's one on the corner, around the corner there, it's printed onto metal from alcohol ink. So I was asked earlier what I'm going to be doing next. And it's a good question, not one always easy to answer. But as an artist, I feel I had when I interview a meeting with my tutor when I was at Oxford in my second year. And he said to me, what is your work about? And I said, I'm trying to work that out. He said, good, you don't have to answer that question. I'm just throwing it at you because for many artists, what are you doing is an important question to ask. And then I looked at him and he said, I think I may have a clue for you. I said, please, because I trusted this man and he's my mentor, still is my mentor. He said, you spent a lot of time painting the world as if it is moving in front of you, which is fine. He said, but when you fly, when you do your karate or judo, you are in time and motion. How can you bring, I can see that. How could you bring that energy? They said, so paint as if you are moving, not as if you're painting the moving world. And that was like, okay, that's what I'm still trying to do. Seems simple, but it's very important because I was painting ballet dancers, judo players, clouds moving through the sky. All of that's important to me. But what I really wanted to create was something as if you were holding something. It was a German writer, and this is a crude paraphrase, but it's, you know, it doesn't do it justice, but it tells a little bit. What is a painting? He said, a painting is a meeting place between psyche, chemistry, time, space, surface, sexuality, beliefs, etc., in which a kind of dance occurs with materials, a brush and surface, to create a kind of crystalline structure that contains unmentionable experiences into a cohesive whole, which at a certain point reaches a point of pause. It's not finished, but a pause long enough for the artist to retreat, so they see it as if for the first time, because it is new to their eye. And at that point, that frozen crystalline material moves away from the artist and is then beheld by another as they come to it. And that energy through consciousness is reignited back into experience. And that is the translation of painting from real energy, psychic energy, physical energy, archiving back into consciousness again. And what I learned looking at art from around the world, particularly from China again and Japan or something, because that aesthetic just appeals to me, the subtleties of it, and I need to do a lot more research. I speak to you as a very much an amateur researcher, but I'm getting there slowly with the help of many people, hopefully learn more. But what I've learned so far is that there, and why working with Ming has been so important, is that there are these strange connection points. So I want to separate, I want to celebrate the separation as also to celebrate the point of meeting. Difference is a point of meeting, not separation. Boundaries are to be crossed respectfully, not to be retreated from. And in the era we're living in right now, that's ever more important. So we come to each other with sentience, belief and passion, and the currency of art is to communicate, to share with the world. That's its purpose, to let other people know there are things in the world and the way they can look at them, be it political, sexual, social. There's many things you can be covering. And the artists sometimes try to do too much. And I think you need to find out where your arena of experience is and where you can best contribute. So for me, I feel myself, I am a landscape painter who looks to the East for inspiration and to contemplate and to try to understand how geography and spirituality, which are the foundations for most cultures, have an effect on aesthetics and how those can be meted and explored individually by research, conversations, and experience. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. My name is Jianhua Xu, the curator of the Silicon Valley Asian Art Center. I'm so sorry again for the Zoom accident today. It's the third time. Sorry. So
Tell me that.
Hold the feng shui. Yeah, we had a very good feng shui for artists here, but it's a bad feng shui for Zoom meetings. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Yeah. We can find a way to share the PDF for us. Yeah. We have the lot. Yeah. If you have any questions, yeah, please.
The Western influence on you, like the light and also
people.
I always wonder, I know you can make layers,
Right.
make dozens of layers.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, that's a good question. Stop. That's an age-old question. You know, you're a painter. So you know, when is it finished? And that idea, going back to the quote I just gave, when all of a sudden I don't quite know what to do next, does there therefore not need to be anything? Because I believe that most painters are probably painting the same thing over and over again. but we're never the same. Always. So another day, painting may be working on something different, but eventually you get to the point where you've done all you can. So I work on the basis that if I reach that point of a pause, and Rothko talks about the idea, you come in to a painting you've been working on, and if you see it as if for the first time, you probably appreciate it. And that's what I usually do. So I work on 2 or 3 paintings at a time. Not often, I don't have them all visible to me, because I don't want to just bleed one into the other. Each difference is important. But then I get to a point, if I come in and I think, oh, I don't know what to do to that, and that's usually my sign of finish. But I work on the basis that really they're part of an ongoing continuum. The paintings are really all of this work. It's extraction points. But like when one breath, automatic the foundation, another breath. So in a sense, it's like each one is just like the space between notes and music. It's where the structure comes. So for me, with music, this is an orchestration that's ongoing. And it will end when I don't make paintings anymore.
Does your like aesthetic value have dominance decide when you finish, or you would?
It's purely emotional, yeah. But emotion, it's like I feel this is okay, it's right. I can let it go. Because otherwise you tend to worry, that, like, oh, I'll fix this, fix that. And one painting I remember working on, apart from the unicorn disaster, but there's one where I worked on, and there's a section of it, and I think, oh, I just love it. I think, oh, come on, take out the whole thing, start again. I've done that many times. After 20 or 30 or 50 hours, I paint it out, because I know something's going to go on there, it's not happening there. And I don't want to do another paint, that has to happen there. And I find it again, that's good. And that's my only time where I really work hard to try to complete something consciously.
So could we use this as an example to illustrate the process and also the interaction between your inning and then the environment at the moment that you create the art? I mean, first of all, how big is this piece?
6 by 6 feet.
And when actually you started to paint, and how long did it take?
This painting, if I measured it, good question, probably the totality would be at least 70 to 100 hours.
Yeah. But I sort of from layman's point of view, I see sort of some interaction or maybe interrogation or maybe antagonizing of the tectonical forces that actually interplay. I don't see too much of the antagonizing because I see harmony even because of the color tone and the displays of it.
Right.
So what exactly, no, that's the wrong one. What is the theory in the direction you want to deliver? What kind of message you want to deliver for this particular piece?
The idea of contrast and compromise, maybe. That's the idea, all things are relative, there's the idea, I want to have grandeur. Interesting, and thank you for pointing out, because this idea of, understand from the idea of qi, which is flow, but then there's also the term sha, which I've understood, which is used in feng shui, where hard deflections occur. So fracturing is very important, because that's discontinuity. So you have something which is soft and developing, and then suddenly it's fractured. And it's just a massive transition. And it's the idea that there's multiple sensations in there. There are forms of multiple horizons which are just broken and shattered.
And I think it cannot be basically acrylic silk, right? It's on canvas, right?
This is acrylic on muslin, which is very thin silk.
What is muslin?
Muslin is very thin canvas, but it's much finer, like portrait linen, but it's much less expensive. But I like the texture more than linen.
But we'd love to see the real. But this piece is not here.
No, but there's a sister piece which is on the back wall there. You can see the same process. Same size.
So because of the muslin, like you see actually some interaction between the thin layer of the canvas and the painting. Okay.
And that's what I'm talking about. Like with Ming's painting, they're in where the West you have surface, then you make a painting. But this is painted directly in. This is why I'm trying to make the painting integrate with the image. So there's not a separation point.
Is there a piece like you have a silk? Is there a piece here?
Let's have a look.
It's better like he show us around.
That's okay.
Right?
That's a good idea.
This one here. machine. You feel it.
Yeah.
So this was the old Ollie painting, very small. I wanted it to be big. I digitally enhanced it, I scanned it, and with a friendly builder, and I put it on the advertiser, and then I reversed it. So the image is on the back side, then I had the layers of the. This is a sister piece of the one you were doing.
Oh. Really?
Yeah, this is it's like it's not a diptych, but it was done at the same time. Yeah.
I can guess it. It's also the so because how it interplay of the light yellow and green.
Yeah.
The one is dark blue and red. So you actually put in juxtaposition side by side.
Yeah, in this instance, because I was given these cameras rare, and they were already primed, so I spent a long time sanding them so I could stain them and put the color into the surface.
Do you paint them together?
No, I painted at the same time and not different. I wanted to be different.
But is that one available?
That one there,
Yeah.
but sometimes I paint over them. I have to think about that.
Yeah.
How do you start? What do you like? Do you wait for
I'm in a state of mind where I start horizontal and I put medium on and I just throw stuff on.
How do you know what to do?
Well, just because I've been doing it for a long time, I certain mediums within me, certain kind of quality. So I use general rules when I stain it, then I get a medium of quality.
You mentioned that you follow your feelings. So what has been leading you to create that kind of?
Big question. Well, I think for me, painting is very emotional, but I also think of it, I'm more aware of it. When I began looking at some Chinese painting, realized, and I was reading some writings by a Chinese scholar, and they said, perhaps we could less of feeling and more of the kind of connection. That makes sense. I'm trying to, it was by a literary one of his paintings. And it's written there, here is Mr. Turner for us. An image of absolute primordial chaos. A mad or invoke. And that was meant to be condemnation. That was a fantastic compliment. Yeah. Because he was actually understanding that we didn't like what he was saying. I mean, he's speaking very carefully. I would like to think I have that kind of connection to the idea of the original chaos of the earth and its magnificence. It's, you know, the fact that nature is our contained. You know, we have this living very fast. Stupidity is also in nature. Nature doesn't care. Nature doesn't make. Let's not get too romantic, but it's family people that we begin to understand as not other, but as part of us. And people from China have a better one. Sadly, in the modern world, they've got that, they're polluting everything. But we did it in the West. But Chinese historically did it. No Indians did it. Native Americans did it. It's only when Europeans planted it and planted it in. So for me, the landscape is inscape is what happens when I do this, as opposed to when I do this.
Yes, thank you. And also I thought, you know, you mentioned that your philosophy is influenced by Far East, like some Chinese ideas, philosophies. So when you read things, do you think you meditate into the images? Depend and follow your feeling and meditate into your creation ideas.
Yes. I think, I mean, the fact is, it's consciousness archive. For me, this is like a psychic archive. Consciousness has no reality, there's an energy. And then as painting, it be manifest as marks, textures, which you may see. But you see something that has some way of being seen beyond you. But hopefully, you know, this could be what I'm interested in. It's like the West is the street, in China, this is. And I like pairing idea, the darkness of traditional, Christian darkness is without light. And Chinese void is often pale, not dark. So just that an idea of, that in West writers are evil. Many ancient objects, they're not evil, they're interesting features, but in West, so these geographies have a big role in our life. So when I go to the Chinese landscape, I have to learn to understand spaces again in a new way. I don't understand it, I don't understand language and science. I said that you become much more visual now you're in a place where you can't read what a sign says. You can become much more aware of what, if you don't have that, as a tailor, that's everything. So that's why I like going to China, and being a little bit of the language itself to keep me more alert to what I'm looking at. I'm not proud of doing that, but it helps. Because in the landscape, I'm in birds, so I don't understand half the birds I see in China are just beautiful, but they're different. And the trees are not quite the same, they're similar, but the differences are fantastic. And occasionally you see all that, like, it's, but the differences are important. So the idea of we, as we move through space and time, I remember talking when I came back to Japan for the first time. We went to the Forbidden City, and we could see the gardens where they used to float things down the river for party. And this idea, I was walking past the school. This woman was doing Tai Chi, walking backwards up the street as I walked to school. She was a little smaller than you, and I walked past her first. I said, I'm saying no more change. So every morning. Then after what I thought, China, people go back to the future. In the West, go forward into the future. China, unknown until it becomes your present. You watch the present become your past in front of you as you continue into the future. Simple. So when they're painting, same thing. We have this relatively identifying Chinese comes to something.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the compromise.
Yes. But it's this idea of walking backwards, like Aboriginals do, they walk the land backwards. You see, then the experience becomes known, and then you see it evolve into something else. So as a painter, you go like this, painting, we go like this, painting. I have a love of this. Because this idea of where we are in Chinese space is critical. And then the Western idea of measure things, it's not good or bad, it's different. Chinese is much more holistic in its orientation, historically. But it gave us gunpowder, it gave us paper, incredible images. But at the same time, there's a way of painting which is very different from them. It's rational, kind of rational. And now we're very much in this technology, but I think what is needed in the character of a country is important to think about. And I don't want that to be lost, we evolve, it's important, but it's like I want to hear when a Chinese person plays Brahms or Wagner, I'm interested to hear that at an Italian or an English person, because it's going to be slightly different. And that's precious. Still doing music justice with their being. That individuality is within the collective.
Thank you.
A little bit about the process of this one. The voice is very powerful.
This one is interesting. Mostly this when I started it, I thought something happened. It's not right. And I was very hard at 117 degrees, perfect for dry painting. I wasn't wearing a lot. I sprayed myself with water, and I had to be front with this. And I walked around it. It's like not a big day. And I had the white, it's really high flow. And so I had paper, which I knew because sometimes I collage, but I wanted the paper. It is not Chinese paper, it's newspaper. It's very thin paper. But if I make it wet, paper will fit underneath the residue, so I get its skin. So I did that, then I flooded it with water, then I put a sticker on the wall strip with photo hang, and then 2 days later I pulled off paper and that was all that's left. So I had it. This is very atmospheric and it's very physical, and it's a very powerful, it's unusual structure for me, but I like it, but it's shocking myself. I tend to harm my this.
Yeah.
More of a goal just.
The white is very
Yes.
yes.
Yeah. But this good because when I saw one of the great paintings, the church in Italy, and on it saw the 8 years ago, it's probably about this big. And as I walked up, There's a tree. When I went up, the sky was lit, and the tree just stayed. Wow. He's made the sky material and the object against. Brilliant. So that was later. I thought, oh, maybe that's what I was thinking about. So they get material that comes in. And so the photographs of us, the photographs of people that have a limitation, and the limitation is continuous. So painting has the reality and morphology. Part of it is physicality. Watercolors have one way with ink painting. Oil has more weight, power, so and the acrylic has similar things in a different way. So the physicality is not in part of it. There's what we call the image, and then we call the visual reality. And then,
Any question?
oh yes,
In chat, Jim, can you, yeah, you do that as a live record.
oh,
Yeah. Is there a photograph?
no photographs. No photographs, everything paintings, everything painted. Ink and
But there
paint.
was paper pieces now.
Hey, there was paper here.
Yeah, but then you tore out the paper afterwards, right? So then there's no more paper.
No, everything is
Okay.
painted.
But it looks like there is paper.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, how things end, I mean, this is like sharp, soft, but again, when I used to Chinese and Japanese things, these sharp, soft, very much, I mean, you see them, Rembrandts, you see them, and something for me, because of this idea of insert, and what's great about the mirror and they build up to it, so they're building it, it's really rich, and has depth to it, rather than being dry.
Anyone have questions?
So I have an academic question.
Oh.
So if you would look at your history of creation, right? How would you actually characterize your own development status?
How would I say?
Characterize the your development in terms of status or signature? How does it evolve?
I think probably I'm learning to trust my instincts more. I'm learning to, whatever knowledge I have, I hope is sort of within me, not often students say to me, don't want to think about it. And what they really mean is, I think I don't want to be self-conscious. And what I'm hopefully becoming is freer. Part of this process is, you would learn to a certain level. I think I always quote the de Kooning statement where he said, in effect, I learned the first 15 years of my life to be accurate and precise, the rest of my life to be true. And that's how I feel about it. I was well taught certain linguistic structures, basic Canada drawing, color theory, etc. Then with China, I'm still a novice, but I don't want to be a Chinese painter, but I want to understand that art properly. And then it will be part of my psyche, and then I will iterate. So I think, to go back to the idea, the thing I first did when my instructor said, make things as if you are moving, not of the world moving around you, was the liberating point. And the plane flight was kind of a really powerful reinforcement of that, but ever since then, it's been the same kind of investigation. So I think, well, I mean, it's also this idea, the older you get, the more you think about the eternal, in a good way, because I'm dealing with students, magnificent students, but a lot of them are concerned about the contemporary. The art world is obsessed with the contemporary. I think, okay, that's important. But I want to do a class at the Art Institute one day called The Notion of the Eternal, and think about, for filmmakers, performance artists, painters, what does that mean? So I think, the contemporary has come to mean often timely, fashionable, hip, identifiable, knowable. And I don't think that painting's role is just to do that. It can be one of the things it does. But for me, I want to feel, like to feel I have a lineage that goes back to Turner, to some of the Chinese artists I've enjoyed. I'm part of that continuum. They are their own star. I'm not trying to put myself with them, but I feel a connection. I say to my students all the time, part of your role as an artist is identifying your artistic family. Your Chinese grandmother, your African great-grandfather, your British mother, whatever it might be artistically. There's many people you can bring into your family. And as we develop as artists, if you begin to understand that family, you feel a connection to them. All art connects you, but to certain people, you feel an affinity. So I'm more, I had this, when I came back from China on one occasion, I was reading my George Riley book, The Principles of Chinese Painting. And in it, he cites, a Taoist cannot be a romantic. I was like, oh no, this is terrible. I want to be a romantic and a Taoist. How is that possible? He said, not possible, because the Taoist is connected to the universe. The human is connected to nature through Tao. Humans are created by God to be in the world. A made universe and an unmade universe. So I want to go to the unmade universe. That's where I want to belong. So part of my journey is not to deny life, but I am who I am because of my experiences. But part of that, my own learning journey, is what I'm hearing, what I call whispers from the East, to put it romantic. That's what it is. It's like, there's something here I don't know about. I want to know more about. And when I see some aspects of that culture, I may even feel maybe many years back, maybe I was there once. But I remember in a bamboo forest, my first bamboo forest, I was holding onto the bank and I was literally moving with the wind. It was fantastic. And the woman who was translating came up, she came to, Jamie. I said, yes, you are dreaming from long ago. I said, how did you know? And she was right. And I had this one dream, which haunted me for years, from age 5 to 7. I used to drive my parents nuts, saying, have we ever been to a house where it's flooded garden with white house? And she said, no, I don't think so. I kept dreaming of this. And then I forgot it. I'm 42. I'm with my students in China. We're going in Hangzhou to see the bamboo forest, or back from the bamboo. We stopped because the road works. I wake up from the bus and down there's a pathway, a white house, red shutters, green shutters. I said, that's my dream. It was paddy fields, people say. It was green, but it was paddy fields, not lawns. So did I dream that? I don't know, but that felt like I knew it. So then I thought, my sense of time and space is very different from what I've been told it should be. I think life is more interesting. And you hear this from people who see great thinkers, great artists, musicians, whatever. They all give us insights into the possibility of what can be. So we all live, I think most of us live in some kind of garden. It's normal, but I want to get to the edge of my garden and look out into the landscape that's beyond, metaphorically and actually. And as an artist, one can do that. I can go up in planes and do all that stuff. But in my studio, my partner often says to me, you seem very happy. And I say, well, I've been traveling today. This is all travel. Every time I go to the studio, I'm going somewhere, into my past or into somewhere I didn't know. And then somehow I find it. I've never been here, but then now I know it. And I know I could annotate it to, China, Iceland, Wales. I could literally do that, but I don't choose to. But I know we're a matrix in the end. And so, much abstract art tries to open up possibilities, but I don't see the differentiation. Every act of art is not abstraction. It's just by degrees that it changes, But for me, I want there to be the phenomenal world and what Kant took the noumenal, the untranslatable. Because consciousness, I think, has no form except in the way we live our lives, how we interact, and things that we do. So these become archives of states of mind.
Okay, last question, Lei.
Oh.
Hello.
Given this art has so many dimensions, and essentially the definition of art is awakening. I have one question. So every piece of artwork, do you have some intention to begin with, or sometimes?
Very rarely a specific intention. I think if I'm working at a certain scale, I'm going to think, and this is an interesting question because this idea of spontaneity and improvisation is that's vital to certain art practices. And I think I say to my students and to myself, we make art between strategy and chaos. And some people are very strategic and some are very chaotic. I think I'm somewhere in the middle, but sometimes I go this way, sometimes that way. So the intention is to create visual spaces which are born of a meditation on the natural world, but that natural world is both internal and external. Going back to this, everything we see is conditioned by various things of distance, frameworks, etc. So for me, the painting in part is being a kind of dissection in part of the history. When I look at the Constable painting or Turner, they've done that. I can't do anything better than that. It's not a competition, but they have said something so perfectly. So other ways, like Cézanne made a perfect statement about that in a totally different way. So I want to add to that canon, but I need to do it in my case. When I saw the Northern Lights, and then I started playing with the ink that gave me that image, I thought, this is how I can speak of the Northern Light energy. Not what they look like, but what they feel like. What sensation they give, a fluidity. So, you know, but I want there to be a familiarity because that will hold people's attention. And I want them to go, what am I looking at? I don't really want them to go, I don't like this. But I do want them to go, I'm not sure I like it, but I'm intrigued to know more. If I can do that to somebody, I'm happy. They're not liking it, buying it. It's like if they just form a connection with what I want to do is to create an experience for you. There's the final quote I gave, which is, I think, very important. Robert Irwin, the great American artist who became a light and space artist, fantastic painter, but he found painting didn't say what he wanted. And he said, I got to the point where I became very confused because every time I made a painting, I had this sense that however abstract I made it, somebody would find that's a leaf, that's the edge of something, because they were still bound to representation. What I wanted was the first order of presence. And I thought, I want that. So I don't mind you seeing a leaf. I don't mind you seeing water. I just don't want you to name the river or tell me what kind of tree. In that sense, don't literalize it, but do have that connection because I want you to feel like that's a sense of connection you have to it. But, you know, so this idea of we are surrounded by images which we're supposed to read. And we have been critiqued, we talk class and people say, I don't get it. And I say, well, how long did it take to make? These things are ages. The famous line by Degas, when he was asked by his dealer, and he was with the dealer with a potential client. The client said, how much is this? He goes, oh, that's 450 francs. He goes, that's a lot of money. How long did it take you? He said, 48 years. You know, and we forget this. So seriously, there's a life experience, and that gives your work a certain depth. You know, you can have young, spontaneous, wonderful things, but you know, a masterpiece is not actually the end of your life. It's before you, when you end being a student and start being a master. But it's that moment where you realize what you need to learn to go on the journey. So, you know, it's a good question because, you know, you look at this stuff and I can only say I'm working, I read a lot of books, I look at a lot of films and things start to haunt me, memories haunt me. When I come back and I start working, sometimes I'm in Europe in my head. Sometimes I'm thinking about China, not consciously, I have the music on, or I've just seen a film and I'll just see what happens and have to trust my instincts then. Afterwards, I analyze it, but not before.
You let it appear to you.
Yes.
Let it come alive
Yes.
to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because you're releasing something. I feel like you're releasing something.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, it's chasing your own tail otherwise, you know, and that's like, I just want that it's like the spontaneity is the unforeseen has occurred and I'm going to embrace it.
Okay, thank you everyone. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hello everyone. Thank you. 谢谢大家，谢谢大家。
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
拜拜。大家可以拍一张照跟那个 Can we together here take a photo? Yeah. 好，关掉吧。我帮你们拍吧。哎，这个不要了，这个关掉吧。
Thank you.
Very inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I know you're going to interrogate me one day.
来吧，来，大家来。
With some